Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett, and welcome to a new episode of UFOs in the Paranormal. Today's episode is called The UFO Invasion of California's Military Bases. This is kind of a sequel, a follow-up to my other YouTube episode, The UFO Invasion of Edwards Air Force Base. And as the name implies, this is all about cases in which UFOs have hovered over and investigated various military bases in California. Pioneering UFO researchers Jim and Coral Lorenzen were among the first to be able to predict UFO sightings, and they noticed that whenever there was a new installation, a military base being constructed, sure enough, there would be UFO sightings over that area. And we certainly see that with California. California leads the nation in terms of the number of UFO reports, and we have an awful lot of military bases here, so it should come as no surprise that there have been many cases in which UFOs have hovered over military bases here in California. So I have about a dozen cases I'd like to share with you today. Some are really quite dramatic, others are pretty brief, but I think they really show an interesting aspect to UFO behavior, show that they're really keeping a close watch on our military activities, and that's why I wanted to present this episode to you today. So let's get started. The first military installation to attract the interest of UFOs is probably the Santa Rosa Naval Auxiliary Station in Northern California. And at 5 p.m. on July 3rd, 1947, this is nearly the same time as the Roswell UFO crash, trained observers at the base observed a 20-foot metallic saucer hovering only 1,000 feet above the main runway. So that's quite low. And as one of the observers said, and I quote, "It was covered by silver material that looked like airplane aluminum. There were no marks of any sort on the surface. It was perfectly smooth. It had no wings, no apparent projections of any sort." This was just the beginning of the UFO wave that would sweep across the United States. It was really a super wave. And it wasn't long before there were more cases of UFOs hovering over military bases. In fact, that same month, only a few weeks after that, another California military base was targeted by UFOs. It was at 2:50 p.m. on July 29, 1947, that Hamilton Field experienced its first of many surveillances by UFOs. One of the witnesses was Lieutenant Ward Stewart and Assistant Operations Officer Captain William Ryherd. They were both on the base when they observed a 25-foot, shiny, whitish disc overtake a P-80 jet fighter, which was coming in for a preliminary approach at about 6,000 feet. And seconds later, both officers observed an identical disc maneuver in a protective left-to-right pattern over the first disc, after which both continued southwards. So Project Blue Book intelligence officers were called in to investigate, and Lieutenant Stewart testified that the objects he saw were unlike any conventional aircraft in his considerable experience as a B-29 pilot. And Blue Book officers were unable to explain the sighting and labeled the case unidentified. This is one of the first Blue Book cases, case number 69. But this sighting marked the first of a series of sightings that would occur regularly over Hamilton Field. And the next sighting occurred about 3 years later on June 25, 1950. On that occasion, at 1:35 a.m., Corporal Garland Pryor was at the base when he observed a strange object pass overhead at 5,000 feet elevation at a speed he estimates of about 1,500 miles per hour. So he alerted Staff Sergeant Ellis Lorimer, who had 3 years' experience in control tower observation, and he also observed the object as it made 2 additional passes overhead. Meanwhile, another person on the base, Staff Sergeant Virgil Capurro, observed the same mysterious object, and he used binoculars to look at it and still could not identify it. None of the airmen were able to identify this object, which eventually disappeared over the Pacific Ocean, trailing a blue flame, they said, like an acetylene torch. So, 2 years later, the UFOs were back. On August 3rd, 1952, officers at the base observed two huge silver discs maneuvering directly over the base. The radar tower was immediately contacted, and radar operators verified on their scopes that the objects were circling the base. Several F-86 jets were quickly scrambled to intercept the craft, and at that point, 6 additional discs suddenly appeared and assumed what looked like a defensive diamond formation around the original craft, and then seconds later, all the objects quickly accelerated out of sight. So a pretty amazing series of sightings. And around the same time that this was going on at Hamilton Field, there was another series of sightings that was probably even more dramatic at George Air Force Base. George Air Force Base is located in the southern California desert, just north of Los Angeles. And in May of 1952, the base experienced what researcher Michael David Hall calls, quote, a particularly intense series of sightings. And in fact, this wave of sightings over George Air Force Base remains one of the most extensive of all the California bases, excepting perhaps Edwards Air Force Base. So it all began at 10:50 a.m. on May 1st, when 4 officers in the base range control tower observed 5 white discs swoop down from the direction of Apple Valley and cavort over the base. And one of the control officers released an official statement saying, and I quote, the objects, 5 in number, appeared to be round and disc-shaped. The diameter of these objects seemed to be greater than the length of an F-15 fighter plane. They were of a flat white color and gave off no glare or reflection. They moved in formation with the last 2 darting around in a circular motion. I estimated that the speed of the objects was about twice that of ordinary aircraft, and the altitude of the objects to have been about 4,000 feet. Another witness to this event was actually the wing director of George Air Force Base. He was playing golf about 4 miles north of the base when he saw one of the mystery objects, and he later told investigators the shape of the object was round. I could not see if it was shaped as a ball or a disc. It was white in color, made no noise, had no visible exhaust, and the speed appeared to be in excess of 1,000 miles per hour. So once again, Project Blue Book officers were called in to investigate, including J. Allen Hynek, and as Hynek says, and I quote, the discs were very maneuverable, appearing to almost collide and break away. Blue Book officers were very impressed. They did not know what to make of these objects. They clearly weren't planes, and they declared this sighting unidentified. This is Blue Book case number 1176. So while base personnel assumed that the sightings were over, actually they were just beginning. This was going to be a very busy month. It was only 8 days later, at 10:30 a.m. on May 9th, that an officer at the base sighted a round silver object maneuvering overhead. At the same time, pilots in 2 F-86 aircraft also observed the same object, which quickly darted away. And it was only 2 hours later that the UFOs were back. And on this occasion, numerous personnel on the base observed these 2 objects make a low, slow pass over the base. And the objects were described as having, quote, a silver metal color with a dark spot in the center, and at certain angles to the sun gave off a bright glare. So the day wasn't over yet. Just a few hours later at 5:20 p.m., additional witnesses observed a, quote, dull-colored object in the shape of an arrowhead pass high overhead. So I don't know what's going on during this month, but it was busy. For 2 days, there was no apparent activity. Then at 12:20 p.m. on May 11, a large whitish object shaped like a white paper plate was seen tumbling over the base at jet speed. And at one point, this object appeared to reduce its speed, and then it quickly darted away at high speed. 2 days later, at 2:25 p.m., this was May 13, the base was again put on high alert when a single round shiny metal disc hovered stationary overhead, remaining in view for more than 30 minutes. So that's quite a long time for an object to be hovering over this very sensitive military base. And it was the very next day, on May 14, when this disc was back again. This time it showed up at 2:05 p.m. and was observed by many officers who agreed that it appeared to be the same object. Then, 1 week later, on May 20th, the disc returned for what appears to be its final survey of George Air Force Base. It appeared right on schedule at 2:25 p.m. and remained hovering stationary over the base for about 5 minutes before moving away. So not surprisingly, this dramatic series of multiple sightings caused a major Air Force investigation, and the head of Project Blue Book, Captain Edward Ruppelt, arrived on May 20th at George Air Force Base for what turned out to be the day of the last sighting. Ruppelt had high hopes of seeing one of the saucers for himself and convinced the base commander to scramble a T-6 jet to look for the UFOs. Unfortunately, Ruppelt didn't see anything except for a balloon, and for whatever reason, the sightings at George Air Force Base had come to a sudden end. And once again, Blue Book officers were unable to find an explanation for this series of sightings and were forced to declare this case unidentified. This became Blue Book case number 1194. So George Air Force Base was apparently of particular interest to the ETs, and it should come as no surprise that there was yet another sighting there. This was several years later, on the night of June 17 and 18 in 1969, when 2 base security policemen observed what they described as a bright orange-colored object hovering overhead. They think it was quite large. They estimate that this object was at least 375 feet in diameter. And after just a few moments, this UFO flitted away, and this account was actually leaked to the press by an inside source, and otherwise would probably have remained a secret, which is one of several reasons why I think most of the encounters that we know about represent just the tip of the iceberg. Meanwhile, the UFO reconnaissance of California's many other military installations continued, and the next one occurred over McClellan Air Force Base. This was on March 13, 1951, when both military and civilian witnesses reported strange UFO activity over the base, and once again, Project Blue Book officers came in to investigate the case and labeled it unidentified. This became Blue Book case number 907. So the 1950s were really, really active. The next military base to be visited was Travis Air Force Base. They had a sighting on July 24, 1952, when personnel at Travis Air Force Base reported a strange object hovering over the base. Project Blue Book officers were called in to investigate, And after interviewing the witnesses, they were unable to find an explanation and labeled it unidentified. This became Blue Book case number 1588. So this just goes on and on. On January 28, 1953, personnel at the control tower at El Toro Marine Base observed an unknown object hovering in the sky. At the same time, officials at the nearby Point Mugu base and Long Beach Airport control towers also observed the object. Marine jet pilot Major Harvey Patton was sent to intercept this mysterious visitor, and he described the UFO as, quote, a large, fiery, red, disc-shaped object. And after 4 minutes of chasing after this thing, Major Patton was unable to close the distance between himself and the object, and the chase was ended. So it just goes on and on. The next case occurred at Norton Air Force Base. And if you look at my episode, California UFO Crash Retrievals, you will see reports of UFOs being held at Norton Air Force Base. But in fact, there are sightings of objects hovering over the base. One occurred on November 3rd, 1953. This is just 1 year after the George Air Force Base sightings. And on November 3rd, a witness identified only as J observed and allegedly photographed an object as it hovered directly over Norton Air Force Base at 4 a.m. in the morning. And it was just 1 year after that that California's Miramar Naval Air Station, located in Southern California, had a really incredible sighting. It was on February 2nd, 1955, when the base went on high alert after numerous officers observed an unidentified object hovering over the base. It eventually darted away. Project Blue Book officers were called in to investigate, and after conducting an investigation, they could not identify this object and once again declared it unidentified. This became Blue Book case number 3416. Year after year, military bases over California, and for that matter, all across the U.S. and the world, are experiencing very close-up UFO sightings. In 1956, a cat-and-mouse game involving UFOs and USAF jet fighters occurred over Castle Air Force Base. When citizens from the nearby town of Modesto called up the base to report UFO activity, 2 F-86 jet fighters were put on alert duty and instructed to fly over the town to intercept the unknowns. However, shortly after takeoff, 2 control tower personnel at the base themselves observed what they described as a, quote, luminous elliptical object hovering over the base. So the interceptors were ordered to return to the base. And as the fighters returned to the base, they actually closed in on the UFOs and approached to within only a few hundred yards of these objects. These UFOs easily evaded the jets by sneaking in and out of the low cloud cover. Both pilots said that they had radar returns on their craft of a solid object. One of the pilots was low on fuel at this point and started to descend for a landing. And at that exact moment, one of these UFOs maneuvered itself close behind the other jet fighter. Fearing a confrontation, the first pilot returned to protect his wingmate, and the UFO then promptly shot off into the distance and disappeared. Investigators ordered the pilots to never discuss the incident. When local citizens outside the base asked for an official explanation, the Air Force said that what the sightings were actually geese. That's a ridiculous debunking explanation and really makes no sense at all other than the fact that there is, in fact, a UFO cover-up. So, meanwhile, the encounters continued. On September 15, 1964, a crew of 120 military personnel at Vandenberg Air Force Base prepared for the launch of an Atlas F missile. This launch took place as scheduled. However, at 60 miles of altitude, the missile mysteriously lost control and plunged into the Pacific Ocean. Dr. Robert Jacobs, who was then a lieutenant, was actually put in charge of filming this incident, and the next day he was called into the office of his superior, Major Mansman, to view the film. And as Robert Jacobs says, suddenly we saw a UFO swim into the picture. It was very distinct and clear, a round object. It flew right up to our missile and emitted a flash of light. Then the UFO flew around the missile twice and set off 2 more vivid flashes from different angles, and then it vanished. A few seconds later, our missile was malfunctioning and tumbling out of control. Major Mansman asked Jacobs what he thought the object was, and Jacobs replied, a UFO. And as instructed, Dr. Jacobs kept the incident secret for 20 years. He only revealed his account after becoming concerned about the UFO cover-up, and as a result of going public, he actually received numerous harassments and threats. Researchers later contacted Major Mansman, who confirmed this incident. So I did present this case on my YouTube episode, UFOs and Rockets, and I have quite a bit of more information about it if you'd like to go check it out. But I thought it was important to include that case here because it fits right in. And the sightings continued. The next military base to be visited is San Diego Naval Auxiliary Air Station. On December 16, 1966, at 9:30 p.m., while exiting the main gate of the base, helicopter pilot Ensign John Schmidt and more than a dozen other officers observed several UFOs hover over the base and start to perform incredible aerial gymnastics. And as Ensign Schmidt says, there were 3 of them. They were bright, round, yellow objects up about 50,000 feet and flying in a triangular formation. We don't know what they were, but none of us have ever seen anything like them. We agreed that they couldn't be meteors. They would hover, then go forward, then to one side. They were traveling at speeds from about the maximum speed of a bomber to about 5 times that. So more and more military officers gathered to watch this, and at that point, yet another UFO appeared. And as Ensign Schmidt says, and again I quote, a 4th one came over the horizon from the east at terrific speed. It came up to the group of 3, stayed near the formation for a minute, then headed east. It dropped to a lower altitude, and the magnitude of its light increased. It dropped 2 spheres of light, which disappeared. Then it headed west, and we lost sight of it. The other 3 objects suddenly disappeared. We had these objects in sight for about 9 minutes, which may not sound like a long time, but when you're seeing a UFO, it is. So the final case I'd like to talk about is a more recent encounter which occurred on February 8, 1990. The witnesses in this case are residents. They are the Siborowski family, and several others observed and actually photographed several UFOs hovering over the 29 Palms Marine Corps Air Ground Combat Base, which is not far from their home. And as Anna Siborowski says, I couldn't believe my eyes as we stood watching the 3 craft approach. We could see their shapes directly against the morning's blue sky. The rising sun glinted brilliantly across their smooth metal skins. So the Siborowski family and others watched for the next 2 hours as numerous craft of different sizes hovered and swooped over the base. It was around this same time that an enormous sandstorm engulfed the base, forcing all field exercises to be shut down, and at 8:40 a.m., the craft suddenly departed. So there you go. That is the cases that I found in which UFOs have hovered over military bases here in California. And I know this is just the tip of the iceberg. The vast majority of cases we don't hear about. They are covered up. There is a UFO cover-up. I did present these cases in my book, UFOs Over California, A True History of Extraterrestrial Encounters in the Golden State. But as I said, this is really just a sampling, a cross-section. I am guessing there are probably dozens, if not hundreds, of cases of this kind. But I think there's enough here to provide a really accurate picture of what's going on. It's clear that UFOs are hovering over our military bases. As to why, we can only speculate. But I suspect that they are keeping tabs on our military technology, our progress with technology, and this sort of thing. So yeah, they're pretty interesting cases. I hope you've enjoyed this episode and perhaps learned something. But until next time, I want to thank you for watching. I truly appreciate it. And as I always say, keep having fun.